entertaining, cool. You're listening to LA Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Innervoice with Dr. Foojan Zeine, only on LA Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Foojan Zeine, and welcome to The Innervoice Show. This show about making a difference in your life so that you can create a free mind and a heart filled with love toward creating a fulfilling life for yourself and everyone around you. I'll bring you the latest research in the realm of human sciences, and we'll talk to experts in their field to bring you the jewel of their knowledge and wisdom. Today, I won't give you the latest research for myself because I have Dr. Antonio Damasio, who is a lead researcher and an author and a psychologist and a neuroscientist, who's going to talk about his own research on our show. Let me tell you a little bit about my book, and then we're going to talk to Dr. Damasio. The book that I want you guys to go and see, my book is Life Reset, The Awareness Integration Path to Creating a Life You Want. This is the latest psychology model that we presented to you in a series of exercises. We've done amazing research in Cal State Long Beach, studies of minimizing depression, 68%, and decreasing anxiety. And all of that is given to you in this book, Life Reset, The Awareness Integration Path to Creating the Life You Want. You can get the Life Reset book from my website, foojan.com. And if you'd like to consult with me, I have my offices in Beverly Hills, Woodland Hills, and Irvine. Or I do a lot of consulting online. So call me or go to foojan.com. I love to hear from you. We'll be right back with Dr. Antonio Damasio. I am so excited and honored to have Dr. Antonio Damasio with me and with all of you at the show. Dr. Damasio is a university professor of neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy, the director of the Brain and Creativity Institute at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He's trained as both neurologist and neuroscientist. Dr. Damasio has made seminal contributions to the understanding of brain process, underlying emotions, feelings, and consciousness. His work on the role of affect in decision-making has made a major impact in neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. He is the author of numerous scientific articles and has been named by the Scientific Information as regarded as one of the most eminent psychologists in the modern era. He's had over 162,000 citations. His most recent book addresses the evolutionary development of mind and especially the role of homeostasis in the generation of cultures. His new book on the subject is The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures. Dr. Damasio is a member of the National Academy of Medicine and the Fellow of American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has won many prizes and awards, and he holds more honorary doctors from several leading universities. More of his books, if you go to Amazon and see it, is Descartes' Error, The Feeling of What Happens, Looking for a Spinoza, and that's the first one I actually ever read from Dr. Damasio, and Self Comes to Mind. But today we're going to talk with Dr. Damasio regarding his latest book, The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures. Welcome, Dr. Damasio. It's such a joy to have you and have you say okay to my interview.
Thank you.
Dr. Damasio, I met you at the Evolution of Psychotherapy, and as you spoke about feeling, I was just listening to you with my eyes, with my ears, with every cell of my body. I've read your book and listened to it. I got it in audio and have read it as I have the book in my hand, The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Culture. You start with this idea of homeostasis, where ensuring that life regulates within a range, this is your quote, within a range that is not just compatible with survival, but also conducive to flourishing. So, and you said that the negative feelings express, from an evolutionary perspective, deficiencies in us, and positive feelings express appropriate levels of homeostasis. And feelings are like subjective experiences, like signals that are telling us where we are and how we could probably correct ourselves. Can you talk about your ideas about this?
Yes, it's a central point. So, as you quite correctly said, we are really governed by this ability, which is a natural ability in all living organisms, to regulate life such that it can continue. And you just pointed to something very important, which I defend in the book. It's the idea that it's not just an issue of balance. Sometimes people think about homeostasis as the achievement of balance in the regulation, but it's actually more than that. It's having, of course, some sort of balance that permits life to continue, but also striving for and achieving a balance that has a surplus that allows us to continue into the future. So life is not just about the moment that we're living, and which, by the way, has just passed. It's also about the moment that is in the future, the next minute, the next hour, the next year of our lives. And it's very beautiful to think that all living organisms come equipped with this ability to manage their life process such that it can continue. And then, as you quite correctly said, feelings, which we certainly have as human beings, and many other species, not just humans, feelings are mental expressions of the state of life regulation. So when you feel well, and when you say, I am really, I'm having a wonderful day, I feel healthy and I feel enthusiastic, those feelings are indicating that your life process, independently of all the thoughts that you're bringing into them, bringing into it at this moment, your life process is actually going very well and is conducive to your survival. Now, if you were saying, I'm not feeling well, I'm coming down with a cold, or I really feel sick, that is an indication that your life process is not going well. So one of the messages of this book is that the life process in humans, for certain, is expressed mentally as feelings. And those feelings, and this is what is so beautiful, those feelings are telling us naturally whether life is going well or not so well. In other words, you don't need to go to the doctor to know that your life is doing well, or to know that your life is actually in some kind of problem, in some kind of jeopardy.
Dr. Damasio, when you said feelings are mental images, I know that in the world of psychology and in what people know on a day-to-day basis, the thoughts and feelings are a lot of times combined. And you had also said that every image that comes to our mind comes with a feeling beside it. It comes with that already. So can you also define, when you talk about mental images, many of us think about mental, when we talk about mental, we also automatically have thoughts in there. Can you define two sets of concept? One is the distinction between thought and emotion and feelings, and then the distinction between emotions and feelings.
Very good. That's extremely important, and I'm glad you brought that up, because the let's start with the distinction between an emotion and a feeling.
Okay.
Because, as you well know, it's very often confused, and people don't even realize that the two things are so distinct and that they should not be confused. So when you emote, when you have an emotion, first of all, even the root of the word, which is the root of movement, you are indicating that your organism is having some sort of action or actions. For example, when you have the emotion of joy, what is happening emotively is that your face adopts certain arrangements that for anyone looking at you will indicate that you are in a state that is positive and that you are, in fact, in joy. So there is a collection of actions that will appear in the musculature of your face and will also appear in the way your body, your whole body, responds to that moment, in the way in which the body will be relaxed or energized, and there will be a variety of changes that are occurring internally that correspond to that joy. Now, all of that is movement. All of that is a collection of actions. When, for example, you are in the emotion of fear, what happens is that there are changes that also occur in your face. There are certain movements. There are movements that occur in your body because your body may look all of a sudden rigid and defensive, and there are things that happen in your muscles. There are things that happen, for example, in your heart that will beat faster, things that happen, for example, to your blood pressure. All of those changes in your organism are, in fact, actions. They are movements. And very interestingly, all of this, or a good part of this, is public. In other words, if you are having an emotion of fear, I will look at you and say, that person is frightened. And I don't even need to know about your heart rate or rhythm or about your blood pressure. I will know from the external actions that you are, in fact, in a state of fear, and that internally, that is your feeling as well.
So am I hearing from you that feelings are the subjective mental image of internal, and emotions are the objective expression of the feelings into your body and outward?
Exactly.
Got it.
That's the point. And the feelings, unlike your emotions, which are to a great extent public, anyone can look at them and diagnose those emotions. Your feelings are private. Only you know about your feelings in a proper sense of the term, because it is a mental, subjective experience that you're having of the state of your body. So if your body is placed in an emotion of fear, you now have the possibility of experiencing what it feels like when your body is in that state. So, as you can agree, this is, it's not diametrically opposed, but it is very, very distinct, it's very different. And it's very important to know that we, as humans, have both emotions and feelings. But, for example, if you were to take very simple organisms that are living, and they're very simple relative to us, but in fact they're full of complicated mechanisms, such as bacteria. Those bacteria can actually have movements, they can have actions that are a little bit like our emotions, in the sense that they react to a certain condition of their environment. But it doesn't guarantee that they have feelings, and in fact, what I claim in my book is that they do not have feelings because they do not have nervous systems that are capable of creating the images of what the body is like in a certain state, and therefore they do not have access to this subjective platform that allows us to know what life is like inside of ourselves. That's a very important distinction.
What I think there was a state of confusion for me, and obviously because I had read it and seen it before, where the confusion was, or what I thought was, let's say, was that the instinctive feelings that shows up for more survival-based, such as like fear or anger or an emotion that all of the feelings and emotions, let's say, that an infant was born with, was named emotions, and then all the provoked one, which was now it went into a filter of a thought or a memory, and then it got created more like some belief system attached to it, and then it provoked more of the secondary feelings. Those were called feelings. And then in your book, I read that you have distinguished all of those as feelings, just some of them as a spontaneous feelings, and this is what you say, background flow of life processes in our organisms experienced as spontaneous feelings, or the other ones which are provoked, which are emotive responses triggered by processing mirrored sensory stimuli such as taste, smell, tactile, auditory, or the ones that are either motivational, like joy, sadness, and fear, jealousy, and programs that are activated and confronted. So this is a very distinct difference that I learned, and I really want our listeners to get this point, because so far in all of the material, we had learned the other way, and now you have brought the emotive concept of the external expression versus the internal process, and they can be both on the spontaneous one or provoked one.
Exactly. That's very important, and it's good that your listeners can get this idea. And of course, in the book, I take pains to explain this as carefully as possible. But let me just elaborate a little bit on the provoked versus the spontaneous. For example, we started our conversation and I gave examples of well-being or of malaise, of feeling sick. These are states that are spontaneous. In other words, you can do lots of things to help your well-being, of course. You normally don't do things to make yourself sick. It just happens to you. But those states, which are states of life, it's how the organism is going. Our organs, our systems, the way our metabolism is functioning, spontaneously either goes into the correct range for life, or it goes into the bad range that spells out the coming of disease and eventually the coming of death. And that is a spontaneous process. It's the way life is. Life is not a stable thing. Life is extremely vulnerable. We are constantly at the risk of disturbing our life process or even losing our life ability. And that happens spontaneously. And those are the spontaneous feelings, the malaise, the suffering, the pain, and so forth that you have out of the physicality of your organism. Now, you also have a number of provoked situations. So, for example, if somebody is unkind to you, or is offensive or is aggressive to you, you are going to respond in a number of emotive ways that result in you feeling bad about that situation. And that feeling, it can be just plain suffering from the situation, or you can feel angered, or you can feel sad. There are a number of reactions that vary with us and with the circumstances. Those are the feelings that are provoked. In other words, it's not just the natural life that we are living right now, it's what happens when we, as we are in the real world, get literally accosted by that real world and played on, literally. And there can be good provoked feelings. For example, somebody that is kind and admiring of you, or compassionate to you, or loving, and so forth. Or there can be the extremely negative situations in which you are badly treated. And those are the provoked feelings that I talk about. Now, something that for you and for your listeners is very important is that these provoked feelings are literally riding on top of the spontaneous ones. In other words, we are never without feeling. We are always, the fact that we are alive and that we have a mind with subjectivity means that we are always feeling something. It can be very good or intensely transcendent, or it can be bad and negative. But then what comes provoked is going to affect what was there naturally and continuously. So we have this very complex world in our minds where we have the spontaneous feelings that represent our being, represent our life, and then we have the provoked ones where we are reacting to the others and to the situations in the world, and then all of that helps construct what we call a conscious mind, with all of these levels that begin with affect and then get progressively more objective in a way as they relate to ideas and to different aspects of the outside world and to different facts.
Can we also go back and create the distinction between thoughts and mental states and feelings? Because what I'm hearing from you is somewhere between the experience of feeling that we have based on our well-being and the distinction between that and the provoked one are a set of thoughts or mental states or attitudes or perceptions that show up that shifts into the provocation.
Exactly. Okay, so that's a wonderful question, and it helps me sort of pull these things apart as much as one can. Let's not be deluded with the idea that we know everything. We don't, but at least we can create a little bit of clarity. So when we talk about a feeling, we talk about something that really disturbs you, that really grabs you. And it grabs you because it has a quality. It grabs you because it is automatically good or bad or somewhere in between. And this is very important for everyone to understand this. The notion of feeling comes with a quality, comes with a qualification. Why? Because it's about life, and life is not indifferent. One thing that it's very clear today, although somebody seems not to notice it, is that we are not robots. We are not artificial intelligence devices. We are living creatures that are vulnerable because we have life, and that need to have a certain dignity and attention paid to it because we are living. Okay, that means that anything that has to do with our life is going to be qualified as good or not so good or terrible. When you have a thought in general, there's no such qualification. In other words, you can look at, for example, suppose you're looking out in the world and you see a very beautiful landscape, or you see a beautiful sunset. The sunset in of itself is a visual image, or you can listen to a piece of beautiful music. And you have images that are, in this case, auditory. They're not visual images, but they are, you can call them images, you can call them thoughts. It doesn't make any difference. It's basically a pattern that you are creating in your brain. The issue is that that pattern by itself is not good or bad or wonderful or terrible. What makes it good or bad or terrible is the fact that that pattern creates a reaction from your organism, in terms of your brain and your entire organism, that is going to classify it as good or bad or terrible or wonderful. So when we talk about thoughts, or about images in general, they are not necessarily qualified yet as good or not so good. They need to have this accompaniment that comes from feeling. And you quoted a line from me a while ago in which you said, images come, have feelings by their side or are accompanied by feelings. This is what is so beautiful and so important to understand, is that you can have an image that is, let's call it sterile. It doesn't have any quality. It is what it is. You can describe it factually. You're describing facts, structures. And then you can have that image provoke a reaction in you, and that reaction, guess what, can be a positive one in which you love that image because it speaks to you, and what that means is that you are having a positive feeling. You're having some pleasure out of that. Or you can look at an image and instead of being the beautiful sunset, be a horrible image of which our world is unfortunately full of, and you are revolted by that image. And that's a negative emotion that you are feeling that you are feeling literally at that point. You emote and then you feel it. So I hope that this gives some clarity into
Absolutely.
This thing. Feelings are, I use in my book, when I talk about the making of feelings, I say, feelings grab you by the lapels. Mm-hmm. Feelings grab, what does that mean? It means that feelings are about life, and life can be good or bad. Whereas an image, an idea, a fact by itself is not qualified. It comes, as I just said, the word occurred to me, thanks to your question, as sterile. It doesn't go one way or another. But then it acquires its quality once we sort of go through it in our system and we qualify it.
This blows my mind when it comes to cognitive behavioral therapy, because as you're talking, I'm looking at, wow, in cognitive behavioral therapy, we say you change your thoughts, you change your emotion. And now what I hear from you is thought and emotions are riding side by side. Thoughts are pretty much neutral unless there's an emotion attached to it that makes it pleasant or unpleasant. And then the question comes that even if we're changing our thoughts, we're not really changing just the thoughts. We're changing the emotion or the feeling, the feeling beside the thought that makes it, shifts it into more of the good or the bad, the more pleasurable or the non-pleasurable. And then when we do that, then it provokes different types of feelings.
Exactly. I think you got the general idea, and it's a very important one, because you see, what we're trying to understand here is not only, of course, how the mind works, but in order to get to that, it helps to know that minds come out of the cooperation of nervous systems and of the rest of the body. Minds don't come out of the brain alone. You have this cooperation. And in order to understand how this is all made, quote unquote, we need to understand the physiology. We need to understand the functions that are operating in a living organism to allow it to generate this mind that is so precious to us, and that allows us to know things, but to feel things. You see, there's another way of putting it is the following, is that feeling and knowing are two different things. When you say, well, I know this poem, or I know this song, what that really means at the beginning is that you know a number of facts, for example, words or musical notes, a certain structure, a certain composition. But the feeling is what results from how that structure, that composition plays out in you. So we have to imagine ourselves as a sort of musical instrument, or even better, sort of a whole orchestra. And the world of our thoughts and the world outside, which is of course represented in our thoughts, is playing that orchestra, which is our organism. And it's as a result of that playing that you get feeling. And the great beauty of this is that we're not looking at the world in a neutral way. I mean, it's a very bad sign if you do, which, by the way, it means that you are depressed. You know, sadness is the beginning of it, but if you are depressed, you can actually get to states in which the world is passing by and it's not playing out in you except to generate sadness or additional bad thoughts. It's not getting the reverberation that we want it to have. So I'm speaking in somewhat poetic analogies, but I think they are necessary for us to see it, and sometimes the poetic analogy gets exactly at the scientific reality.
Yes. So the organism, as you call it, would that also be the self? Is that as the information comes in through our organism, there's a self that sees how it impacts it, and then it has a reaction to whatever it is that is coming to us, or that it cooperates or coexists with the world?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Of course, some people would dispute the notion of self, but your general idea is perfectly correct. Now, you can take the notion of self at many levels. For example, I can talk about my whole organism as myself. But then there's certain circumstances in which you can talk about the self as a sort of collection of mental processes that have to do with our subject and that help generate subjectivity, which of course leads to, is equivalent to consciousness. But in general, what you say is correct. An organism, in a way, is a self. And organisms, because of the fact that they're living, are automatically looking for their own interests, which are, of course, their self-interests, in order to maintain their life. So the way you use the term self, somebody might dispute it, but I think it's generally correct. An organism and the mental notions that we construct about our organism and about our past history, both in terms of our personal ideas and the relation to others, that all is part of a very large encompassing self.
And as you talk about consciousness, is it this being conscious of the mental images, conscious of the feeling and the emoting, the conscious of the self and the process? And then you said it beautifully, as if there's a you watching you doing this, and then maybe even in another, depending on how much meditation you've done, or there's a watcher that watches you, that watches everything. And you expressed consciousness as a beginning, not all of the chapter, but it begun with this concept of that's what we call consciousness, being conscious of the self. Can you explain more about that?
Right. So it's good that you mentioned it. Now this is, when you get into the area of consciousness, that's actually one of the most contentious areas of all of psychology, cognitive science, neuroscience, philosophy, you name it. In fact, there's some philosophers that have described it as a scandal, the whole situation in relation to consciousness. And just recently, in in a review of my book, an author and great knower of human minds, the writer Siri Hustvedt, said, instead of calling it a scandal, it's better to call it a mess, because the state of discussions on consciousness is really a mess. And the reason is that people seem not to agree on what it means. Consciousness is so elastic. We talk about, for example, in social terms, like we have to increase our consciousness of climate change, or increase our consciousness of the problem of drug addiction. And of course, those are legitimate uses of the term. But when we talk about consciousness from the perspective of psychological and biological functions, it means something very simple. It's our ability to have a subjective perspective on our own mental experiences. So right now, I am talking to you. We're doing this conversation on a telephone, which is difficult for you and difficult for me in the sense that I'm not looking at you, you're not looking at me, but I am acutely aware of the fact that you're there on the other side, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that I know what is happening to me in having this conversation. I create this ability to look at myself doing the thinking and the talking in this conversation. It's this ability to literally create a new layer of process that allows you to see yourself doing something. And if you lose that, then you're lost. There will be no way of directing my process, or of you directing your process, or of your listeners making any sense of this, if they were not in this together. If we are all tuned to the same register of mental process. But the key really is subjectivity. Now, there are other things in consciousness that are very important. For example, we have a mental perspective in consciousness that is very encompassing. I explain in the book, has to do with integration of many separate elements. It's like having a good analogy is a cinerama screen. You go to one of those big movie houses where there's a huge screen, side to side, very tall, and where there's sound as well. Consciousness has that element as well. It integrates. For example, right now I am here like an idiot talking into the void because there's nobody else in my office, and I'm looking at my office, and I see the windows, and I see paintings, and I see chairs, and I create a whole picture of this that I could also, it doesn't need to be just a picture in the visual sense, because I can touch the phone, I can touch my desk, and I have many other ways of appreciating this scene from a sensory perspective. But subjectivity is the key to consciousness.
A couple of things come to my mind when we talk about consciousness, beside what I heard from you. One is that I understand that this conversation of consciousness is becoming more prevalent as the artificial intelligence is getting more and more into creating the robots and looking at what is, the programming and what is the thought process or programming they could put. Can they feel? Can they observe themselves? Can they reprogram themselves? And so I get it that trying to duplicate human organism in that way, it takes, they'll have to put it apart and name all of this and see how it all works, so maybe they could duplicate it. So I know from that perspective, there are a lot of scientists are looking at this from their view. And then I also have heard it from the spiritual world or the parapsychology world that comes in and sometimes talks about, as you become more aware of yourself and you're the observer and of the observer, and then somehow you get connected to the consciousness of the world as if there's a collective consciousness. So some people, have experienced that through psychedelics or, just being in the meditative state for a long time, and have also called that in some sense like they call it like expanded consciousness, where it goes beyond just the organism of the self and one human, and it connects to the trees and to the other beings and all of that. And then I guess somehow I could see how it all becomes a mess when each field from its own interest is really looking at the same concept and trying to make sense out of all of it. What do you think about these side notes that I just said?
Well, you touch upon several extremely important problems of our cultural moment. And each of them is worth, if not an hour, hours of conversation and informed conversation. But let's start with artificial intelligence. One of the big problems with the concepts, of course, I have nothing against artificial intelligence. On the contrary, we make good use of it all the time, and the technical advances that are really extremely important in terms of communication, in terms of our manipulation of data, and so forth. What I do have is a problem when people sort of expect that this huge capacity that we have technically to create artificial systems that think and reason, that they then extrapolate from that and they jump the gun and say, well, we can also it's clear that we can also mimic something like human feeling, and in essence we can create the equivalence of human intelligence. That's a very big jump, and I am very convinced that that's not correct. And in The Strange Order of Things, in the new book, I have a whole chapter dedicated to this. And the problem is that, first of all, as a consequence of what we discussed earlier in the program, human intelligence is not just about mathematics. It's not just about putting numbers together or reasoning logically. Human intelligence uses logic, of course, uses reasoning as a very important component of its operations, but there are plenty of other things that we do intelligently that actually come out of our affective world, come out of our emotions and feelings, out of our intuitions, for example, which are fundamentally a result of the world of affect. And so the idea is that what robots and what artificial intelligence systems can do right now, and quite well, is a kind of reasoning that takes the world with a very precise manner and that is easily described in mathematical terms, but it fails where it could describe the equivalent of our feelings. Why? Because our feelings, as we said at the beginning, are readouts of our life state. Well, computers and robots are not living. They do not have any vulnerability. I mean, you can take an axe and destroy them, but they're not going to suffer from cardiac collapse. They're not going to suffer from low blood pressure or from cancer or from diabetes or any of the things that can kill you and me. So
they can be killed. They just won't go through the suffering as we do.
They can be killed the hard way. You know, you have to take them apart with a big axe, and that's not really a killing because there was no life to begin with.
Right.
So I like to say jokingly that no, they cannot have feelings, because to have feelings without life is an absurd concept, and that's what is missing from the equation. And it's so very telling that the great successes of artificial intelligence in terms of mimicking human minds and reasoning have happened with logical systems. For example, the great successes have been beating champions of chess at their own game, or champions of Go, another very important game that comes from Asia. And they can do that because they have huge memory ability, they have huge ways of modeling a logical step, but they lack the feelings with which we normally operate. So, yes, artificial intelligence can totally overtake us in terms of the ability to reason, in terms of logical abilities. They're going to be better than us. They can memorize more things because the memory is basically infinite, where we poor things, we're depending on our hippocampal system and our entorhinal cortex, and we have severe limitations on that. But they are not going to be like us because they lack that ability to experience mentally what it is pleasure, what it is suffering, what it is well-being, or what it is sickness. That's what is lacking.
I am so excited just to hear you and to receive all of this amazing information. I told you before, I think that I have to read your book 5 times, 6 times, just to gain all the different pieces that are there. I would love to ask you to join me again whenever you have time. I love to talk about the conversation about intentionality and what intentions are from the psychological and neuroscience way. It's just there's so much that I just love to pick your brain and who you are and bringing all of this. So thank you. I feel blessed, and I've always told the listeners that I feel blessed that I learn so much every day from the scholars who really do the work, and I get to be the recipient of it. And with the radio show and all of that, I get to share that with the world and who all the listeners are. So
well, you're very kind, and I'm glad that you took the time to read. And I don't think you need 5 times, but you can read it again in bits and pieces. What the parts that please you, because the same way that these things take a long time to think through and to experiment or to reflect and to discuss and then put in words, they ought to take time to be received. Yes. One of the important things in our culture, in any culture in general, is that one has to make an effort to get the goods. Things don't come at you easily. And one of the problems of our culture today is that people are so used to getting things easily in rapid form that they're not taking the time to do what you have done, which is to reflect and think about a problem and then ask the questions and see where that fits.
Yeah, there's just a wealth of information, not only from explaining the brain and the body from a neuroscience place and the biological aspect of it into details, but then the abstract concept of what is, and then linking it to culture and AI and the previous culture, the previous evolution of how organisms were made, and then bridging it into what brings to the future. There's wealth of information, which I really request our listeners to get the book, read it, get the audio, however that it works for the listeners. The Strange Order of Things, Life, Feeling, and the Making of Cultures by Dr. Antonio Damasio. You can get it in Amazon. And if you like to also see more of Dr. Antonio Damasio, please go to antoniodamasio.com. I also know that you are having a sit-down interview and an exploration with Sam Harris in Los Angeles, May 17th. So for people who want to go to that event, please go to samharris.org and get the tickets there. And I think you're going to have your book signing there also, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, so it would be amazing. I also love Sam Harris. I listen to all of his podcasts. I think he's brilliant. And I'm sure that your conversation with him would be out of this world and just brilliance. So I love to hear both of you in the conversation that you both have. Again, thank you for your time and for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And for all of you who are listening, thank you so much for being with us and listening from your heart. Until next week, create a wonderful world for yourself and everyone around you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to The Inner Voice with Dr. Foojan Zeine, only on LA Talk Radio.